Christos Anesti, Christ is risen. I am told first to give you some instructions. There should be a sort of globe image at the bottom of your screen, or wherever or 3 dots at the top, or something that will give you, that will say interpretation, which will allow you to choose which language you want to listen in. This webinar is being recorded, and in a couple of days you'll be able to find it on the Academy's channel on YouTube in both languages. To say a few words of welcome, it's my joy to be able to welcome you all to this evening of discussion organized jointly by Volos Theological Academy in collaboration with the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in the Pan-Orthodox Study Center and Research Center in Cambridge, celebrating 25 years this year, similar age to Volos. One of our speakers, Father Christopher Knight, is a long-time research associate and lecturer at IOCS. Both the Volos Academy and the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies have a particular concern with the ways in which the Orthodox tradition can speak to the contemporary world and topical questions. And that brings us squarely to today's topic: is there natural theology in the Orthodox tradition? For increasing numbers of people in the secularized world, the experience of the holy, the sense of the sacred, even spiritual life starts from the natural world and the insights into its wonder that comes from the natural sciences. Preaching Christ in this context requires us to draw on ancient traditions in the Christian East of allowing the way things are in creation to point and lead us towards their creator. And our 2 speakers are excellently qualified to offer guidance in this in order of speaking. They're Dr. David Bradshaw, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky, has written extensively in this area on ancient patristic and medieval philosophy, and is also co-editor with Richard Swinburne of Natural Theology in the Eastern Orthodox Tradition, published by IOTA, International Orthodox Theological Association. Father Christopher Knight is a scientist. His background is in astrophysics, and he's a parish priest and senior research associate at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge, co-chair of the Science and Theology group at the International Orthodox Theological Association. And his first foray into this area was a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Natural Theology in 2013, and he has since developed the subject in other books. So, Dr. Bradshaw, if you would like to start, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. It's wonderful to be here, and I also want to thank the Volos Academy and the IOCS for this invitation. I think it's a wonderful topic. As you mentioned, I got into it when I was co-editor of this volume, Natural Theology in the Eastern Orthodox Tradition. So I also should thank really the other editor, Richard Swinburne, as well as Paul Gavriliuk, who's the president of IOTA and encouraged us to put this book together. So it's really been a team effort, and I think of it as something that, in a way, is an effort just beginning as scholars begin to think about how Orthodoxy should situate itself in relation to this thriving discourse today that we call natural theology. Of course, it's not something new. It's existed since the ancient world. But I do think it's true that contemporary science, as well as contemporary philosophy, have sort of reinvigorated natural theology. So it's an important topic for Orthodox to address. What I want to do is first sketch what to me is sort of the important global background, you might say, to the whole discussion, which is the understanding of faith and reason as it emerged out of ancient philosophy, and especially out of Plato, really Socrates and Plato, and how that sort of set the premise then for everything we see in the Greek fathers and the way that they use natural theology and the way they understand its role in relation to faith. Because as Orthodox, of course, faith is always first. And even in the book of Hebrews 11, it says that we believe in God based on faith. So we can never forget that. We can never suppose that belief in God is purely an object of objective rational inquiry. It always involves the heart and the whole person, and therefore it requires a responsive faith as well as intellectual belief. So let me start just by reading a short paper, a couple of pages really, that I've written about Socrates and Plato that I think will be the springboard for the rest of what we want to discuss. So this is about what I call Socratic faith, or the faith of Socrates. A striking feature of Socrates in the Apology is, of course, that's the speech he gave at his trial, is how far the conclusions he draws outrun the evidence he cites in their support. He initially cites the oracle, which declared him the wisest of the Greeks, of course, that was the famous oracle at Delphi, as the reason for his questioning and examining those reputed to be wise. Later, he elaborates, mentioning that this task was not given to him by a single oracle only, but, quote, by means of oracles and dreams and in every other way that a divine manifestation has ever ordered a man to do anything. Those are the words of Socrates at his trial. In other words, it is not a task that could be completed once, but an ongoing mission that was given to him through continual direction by the one he calls simply the God. He never names this God. That's an interesting feature of the Apology, even though clearly it must be Apollo who was the God who spoke through the oracle, but he always refers to him simply as the God. This is significant. In other words, the fact that he cites the oracle in this way, for it shows that Socrates lived his whole life with a sense of being answerable and responsible to the God. However, his actual questioning of the Athenians went far beyond merely challenging those reputed to be wise about the points on which they were supposed to have knowledge. By his own account, he challenged not just the wise, but anyone he happened to meet. And he spoke to them with these words, and this again is a quote from the Apology. Good sir, you are an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city, with a reputation for both wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care for nor give thought to wisdom or truth, or the best possible state of your soul? This goes well beyond merely challenging those alleged to be wise. It is a moral exhortation to live in accordance with one's true dignity and worth as a human being. To do so requires seeking wisdom, truth, and virtue. Or in other words, as Aristotle would later put it, it requires living in accordance with reason. Thus, our dignity and worth as human beings is rooted in the value of reason itself. The meeting point of reason with our human identity lies in the soul. And so it is the best possible state of the soul that should be our imperative concern. Now, here's an important question. How does Socrates know all this? It is certainly not a simple deduction from the oracle given at Delphi, nor presumably was it contained in the other oracles and dreams he had received, for he says only that these commanded him to question the wise. It would seem that Socrates, living his life with a sense of being answerable to the God to recognize and understand true wisdom, also drew the further conclusion that reason itself is of inestimable value. From this, he rightly concludes that one should seek wisdom and truth for their own sake, and that to do so is vastly more important than to seek wealth, power, or glory. Socrates then has a kind of dual faith, a faith in the God who has directed him to live his life in a certain way, and a faith in reason as something that possesses supreme value and should be the governing principle of human life. Each aspect of his faith colors and informs the others. Because of his faith in reason, Socrates believes that the God, if he truly is a God, is not arbitrary or capricious, but fully rational. I believe this is why he so carefully speaks of the God rather than of Apollo, the god of Delphi, who, like all the Olympians, could be capricious and even malevolent. And of course, it was precisely this refusal to believe in the gods of the city that led to his trial and was an article in the indictment against him. At the same time, because of Socrates' faith in the god, his belief in reason is not something he affirms in the way one might affirm any other fact about the world. He understands it as simply the extension of the god's commandment to recognize the true meaning of wisdom. Socrates' resolve to seek the truth and live in accordance with it is thus not merely an intellectual act, but a personal commitment that is rooted in his sense of loyalty and obedience to the god. And furthermore, he understands it as not pertaining to his own life alone, but it gives him a kind of evangelical zeal to urge others to do the same and to live seeking wisdom and virtue. All right, now, so we have then two aspects of Socrates' faith, his faith in the god, but also his faith in reason. Now, I want to go on to show that these together lead to a third aspect that's just as important as those two. The dual nature of Socrates' faith implies something else as well. Reason is simply our ability to conform our thinking to reality, or as Aristotle would later put it, to achieve a kind of isomorphism between the mind and its object. If to know reality and to live in accordance with it is something good, that can only be because reality itself is good. The same conclusion emerges when we consider the other side of Socrates' faith, his faith in the god. The one Socrates calls the god is not simply one god among others, but the personal representative of all that is divine. If the god is good, that too can only be because reality itself is good. We find here a third aspect of Socrates' faith, one that is made fully explicit only by Plato, namely that it is also a faith in the goodness of reality. This is what Plato symbolizes through the myth of the sun in the Republic. And I trust people are familiar with this. It's in Book 6 of the Republic, where he likens the form of the good to the sun that illuminates the entire intelligible realm, including giving truth and being to the forms, the objects of knowledge. So in the myth of the sun, the form of the good plays two crucial roles. It is the source of the truth and reality of the objects of knowledge, that is, the forms. Since all other entities are what they are by participating in the forms are thus, in effect, the means of mediating the good to the cosmos. Furthermore, since the good is the source of the truth of the forms, it is the cause not only of the being, but also of the intelligibility of all things. To understand reality is thus necessarily to see it in light of the good. That is the cosmic role of the good. The good also has a more personal role as the object of all desire. As Socrates puts it in the Republic, every soul pursues the good and does whatever it does for its sake. It divines that the good is something, but is perplexed and cannot adequately grasp what it is or acquire the sort of stable beliefs it has about other things. Human life is thus spent seeking the good, most often in wrong ways. Just as we cannot understand reality at large without seeing it in light of the good, so too, apart from the good, we cannot understand ourselves. It was by combining the cosmic and the personal in this way that Plato laid the groundwork for all of Western religious thought. Of course, the form of the good was not Plato's only important contribution. The form of the good is not a personal being, and so is not God or even a god. For Plato's version of God, we must look to the demiurge, the creator, in the Timaeus. Notably, the demiurge does all that he does because he is good, and so wants to make the cosmos as good as possible. The priority of the good as an explanatory principle is thus present in the Timaeus, just as in the Republic. Moreover, the demiurge represents the role of reason or nous in the formation of the cosmos. The fact that his motivation lies in desire for the good thus recapitulates in mythic form the point made in the Republic that all rational thought must ultimately be oriented towards seeing things in light of the good. Those, I think, are the this manifold legacy that the fathers received from Plato, who really permeated the intellectual culture of the ancient world. First, you have the role of faith in the divine, what Socrates refers to simply as the God, who does reveal himself, who even spoke to Socrates in those various ways. And of course, the fathers believe strongly in divine revelation. Also, though, faith in reason, that reason is the faculty we have that enables us to connect to, conform our lives to reality, and therefore is intrinsically good because, and this is the third aspect of that faith, reality itself is something good and something we should want to know, and that in knowing, we also find guidance in how to live as human beings. And of course, what that leads to in Plato is the highest source of reality is the form of the good, or simply the good, if you like. That's how the fathers referred to God, often as the good. Plato also then has this further idea, God is reason or nous, who governs and directs and even created the cosmos. That's what's explained in the Timaeus. And so the fathers inherit that too and adapt it and synthesize it, and will often refer to God in both of these ways as the good and also as nous or reason or intellect. One text that comes to mind that I think is really foundational for patristic thought is St. Basil in the Long Rules, which is a series of questions and answers. So question 2 of the Long Rules, the question posed is, how do we learn to love God? How can we come to love God? And Basil's answer is very interesting. He says, that's not something you can learn, and it's not something you need to learn because you already love God, because you love that which is good, and God is the good. God is the good that we all seek. We simply do so in the wrong ways, not knowing, if you will, how the good is present and manifest to us here and now. And so what Basil says is that we have to submit ourselves to what he calls the school of God's commandments. And of course, those are the commandments of Christ and of Scripture that redirect our desires and purify our desires so that we respond to the good as it truly is and not only as it appears to us through the prism of our passions and appetites. All right, so God as the good is present not only sort of as the ordering principle of reality, but also present in us as that which we innately desire. And another aspect of patristic thought, and this is maybe more directly relevant to natural theology, is that God is intellect or nous. We find anytime we look at the world around us and we see the beauty and the order and the harmony of the natural world, they'd often give examples like the harmony among the 4 seasons, among the 4 elements, as they believed in that time, earth, air, fire, and water, work together, you might say, harmoniously to create this natural world. Also, the harmony of living things, how plants provide food for animals and animals living together in what we today would call an ecosystem. Of course, they didn't use that word, but it all fits together and enables an ongoing harmonious cosmos. And of course, the word cosmos itself comes from the verb cosmein, to order and to arrange something harmoniously to be beautiful. So let me, and I think I have about 8 or 10 minutes. Let me just read a couple of passages here from the fathers that I think illustrate the role of faith in relation to reason and how they work together, you might say synergistically, to come to this recognition of God as the good and as reason or nous. So here's one from St. Athanasius in his apologetic work, De Contra Gentes. If you've read that work, you know that it contains probably the longest statement of the argument from design in patristic literature. I think it's chapters 35 through about 38. This is from a little bit before that, chapter 30. And I picked it out because I think it highlights how he has that same idea that you find in Socrates and Plato, although they don't use the word faith, but that faith as an orientation toward the good is something innate within us. So here's what Athanasius says. He says, the road to God is not as far from us or as extraneous to us as God himself is high above all, but it is within us, and we ourselves can find its beginning. As Moses taught, and this is a quotation from Deuteronomy 30, Moses says, the word of faith is within your heart. This the Savior also indicated and confirmed, saying, the kingdom of God is within you. So since we have faith in the kingdom of God within us, we can quickly come to contemplate and apprehend the King of all, the saving word, the Logos of the Father. So Athanasius thinks that in a way you don't need arguments, you shouldn't need arguments to know and to recognize and respond to God, because God is already present within the human heart. And that's what Christ indicates when he says the kingdom of God is within you. If you know Gregory of Nyssa, his homily on the sixth beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, he understands it in a very similar way. He says, we see God when we view within and turn toward the heart, when the heart has been purified from the passions and from sin and the corruption that evil brings with it. So that's why it's the pure in heart who see God. And of course, that's what we should all seek. And so the knowledge of God can be found within without any philosophical argument or even evidence of any kind, really, within pure human experience. Now, Athanasius does also say, if that's not enough for you, or if you're one of those sinful people, like most of us are, who don't have that purity of heart, well, that's why God gives us other means to know him as well. So this is a passage from his work on the Incarnation, chapter 12. He lists here 3 different means of knowing God through the world around us. And you'll notice the first of these conforms most closely to what we think of as natural theology, although I think the third is also an aspect of it. So let me just read these 3 aspects or ways of knowing God. He says, so they, that is humanity, who's bereft of the knowledge of God, can lift up their eyes to the immensity of heaven, and discerning the harmony of creation, know its ruler, the Word of the Father, who by his providence in the universe makes the Father known to all men, and for that reason moves the universe in order that by him all men should know God. So he's essentially recapitulating here in a very abbreviated way the argument from design. As I mentioned, he gives a longer version of that in Contra Gentes. And you can find this argument prolifically throughout patristic literature. It's in Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzen, St. John of Damascus, and Gregory Palamas, and many others. It's, I think, their favorite form of natural theology, if you like. And usually they'll use it to infer then that God is nous or mind or reason, and we can see that simply through the order and harmony of nature. So that's the first way of knowing God through the world around us. Here's the second way. He says, or if they are reluctant to do this, they can meet the saints and through them learn of God, the creator of the universe, the Father of Christ, and that the worship of idols is godless and full of impiety. In other words, the saints provide us a radically different way of knowing God through the encounter with holiness. And in many cases, the rebuke that holiness offers to us in our sinful way of life. And that's crucial. And of course, Athanasius wrote a whole book about the life of St. Anthony, which has precisely this effect. When you read that life, it leads you to understand that God is present and active among us through the saints, and that you can experience that holiness directly. So that's the second of the 3 ways. And now here's the third. He says they can also, by knowing the law, that is the law of Moses and more broadly, the law of Christ, desist from all wickedness and lead lives of virtue. For the law was not for the Jews only, nor on their account only were the prophets sent, but they provided holy instruction to the whole world about the knowledge of God and the conduct of one's soul. I think there's an intimation here of what in natural theology is often called the moral argument for the existence of God. It's the notion that moral reasoning itself presupposes some kind of divine source. And what Athanasius particularly highlights is, if you will, the experience of the awakened conscience, the experience of through the law, understanding that one's own life and other aspects of the world around us are deeply wrong, are pervaded by sin and evil, and that the only answer to that is by seeking the source of the law, which is not something human or something natural at all, but rather God. And the moral argument, I think, then is another one that's very consonant with the general trend of thought of the fathers. And you'll notice not among these are some other arguments that today figure prominently in natural theology, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, and other more recent forms of natural theology. For the fathers, I think mostly the argument from design and the moral argument, to the extent that it's implicit within moral experience, are really sufficient, because and this maybe it's the last point I want to make, but I think it's important. We should notice not only what they say, but also what they don't say. Not only what they do, but what they don't do. What they don't do is use natural theology, or these two arguments, the argument from design, the moral argument, to construct a whole system of philosophical theology in which God is described and the divine attributes are deduced in great detail. If you know the history of philosophy, you're aware that this practice was already present to some extent in Plato and Aristotle, but really took off in the Middle Ages and becomes a dominant form of thought, I think, at least beginning with Anselm, with his Proslogion as a classic example of doing that, and of course Aquinas and the Prima Pars of the Summa, and many others go on to form these elaborate intellectual edifices based on some initial set of arguments for the existence of God. That's something the fathers don't do. They do give arguments, but for them, these arguments are really just a springboard to open the mind and open the heart to divine revelation. And of course, they'll typically then go on to describe how God has spoken to us, and in fact dwelt among us as the Logos, Jesus Christ, God incarnate in the flesh. So there's something to consider on both sides. Orthodoxy does have a natural theology, but I think it's if you will, a limited and somewhat chastened form of natural theology. And with that, I don't want to hog all the time. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Father Christopher has to say as well.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I think, Father Christopher, if you would like to proceed, and then we'll have questions to both afterwards.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this. The first thing I want to point out is that there's a strong influence of the background on anybody who speaks about natural theology, because there are in fact many different, if overlapping, understandings of what natural theology actually is. Modern philosophers tend to see it as rational argument for the reality of God, based on what one of those philosophers, William Alston, once called premises that neither are nor presuppose any religious beliefs. Others, however, see such arguments in what I see as a more nuanced way, based on theological perspectives. And as the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Natural Theology put it in 2013, one of the purposes of that book was to highlight the rich diversity of approaches to and definitions of natural theology. He goes on to say that the lack of fixed consensus on the definition of natural theology is due in part to its inherently interdisciplinary character. Now, where we come from, how we approach this whole issue, does produce real insights, but it also perhaps produces blind spots. So I should perhaps acknowledge where I'm coming from. I myself came into discussions about natural theology via the science theology dialogue, where natural theology was an important issue because a classic natural theology argument from the early modern period, William Paley's watchmaker version of the design argument, had in the 19th century been absolutely demolished by evolutionary understandings. So that was the first thing. I was aware of a major natural theology argument which simply hadn't worked ultimately. I was also aware of how more purely philosophical arguments of the medieval period had sometimes been demolished by later philosophers, so that Anselm's ontological argument, for example, was strongly attacked by Kant and later philosophers. And on top of those sorts of issues, I was attentive to the way in which Protestant theologians were often suspicious of natural theology, partly because of Karl Barth's stress on the way in which God's revelation of himself in historical acts, certainly in modern forms of natural theology, often had no part to play at all. Now, my first essay on this topic was published in the Oxford Handbook of Natural Theology 11 years ago now. And that article was related not only to science and to Western theological perspectives, but also and mainly to Orthodox perspectives. That's what I was asked to write about. And in particular, in that chapter, as I shall indicate in a few moments, I stressed both in that essay and in later contributions to the discussion, the role in Orthodox thinking of the intuitive mental faculty that ancient Greek philosophers called the nous. Now, David has talked about the nous as reason, but as I shall suggest in a moment, particularly in the hesychast tradition, it's not quite reason as we understand it in the modern world, because it has an intuitive element which goes beyond just discursive argument based on observation. Now, it was in 2019, in the first IOTA conference in Romania, that I started to think even more about these issues, because that conference had sessions that provided the basis for Bradshaw and Swinburne's collection, which has already been referred to, Natural Theology in the Eastern Orthodox Tradition. And I think I perceived at that conference even more clearly than I'd previously discerned a split among natural theology's defenders in the Orthodox world. First of all, there were what we might call pure philosophers, often in the analytic tradition, such as Richard Swinburne. These assumed the possibility and legitimacy of purely philosophical proof or probability arguments for the reality of God, based on what William Alston once called premises that neither are nor presuppose any religious beliefs. But there were also those with a more nuanced theological understanding, and I think David is among these, in particular those who perceived the role of faith in the use of natural theology arguments. Now, my own view on that split between Orthodox natural theologians, or those interested in natural theology, was set out in the St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly, both in a review of the Bradshaw and Swinburne volume and in a separate paper which was subsequently rewritten and abbreviated to form a section of my book Eastern Orthodoxy and the Science Theology Dialogue, which came out a couple of years ago. In those essays, I argued that only the second of these two approaches, with its stress on faith, can be valid, from an Orthodox perspective at least. This view was later reflected in another review of Bradshaw and Swinburne's book by the patristic scholar Father Doru Kostake, in which he said this. He said that to consider natural theology autonomous from the Christian experience, as Swinburne seems to propose, is unprofitable unless it amounts to an academic exercise. For an Orthodox Christian, he continued, an independent natural theology is as illegitimate and ineffectual as the modern separation of systematic, pastoral, liturgical, historical, and biblical theologies. A different kind of natural theology is needed, he went on, one that builds, say, on scientifically established facts and spiritual experience. Moreover, that works at the nexus of many disciplines in patristic fashion. In suggesting this, Kostake continued, I partially agree with Bradshaw and Swinburne's proposal that natural theology can and should be redeployed by Orthodox thinkers. Kostake makes a clear distinction, however, between the rather nuanced natural theology that he advocates and what he calls rationalistic natural theology of the sort defended by Swinburne. And he went on to observe that the chapter in Bradshaw and Swinburne's book that indicates early modern Russian interest in this rationalistic natural theology relates to the period that Father George Florovsky famously called the Babylonian captivity of Orthodox theology, the estrangement of Orthodox theology by cultivating Western intellectualism. There were, of course, as David has indicated, earlier examples of Orthodox natural theology than this modern Russian one. Much of Bradshaw and Swinburne's book gives examples of natural theology by Orthodox writers from many periods. But I'd like to emphasize that we need to be aware of the need to see the use of natural theology arguments in any period in the wider context of the writings in which they occur. Just as with biblical passages, we need to be wary of using these passages as proof texts to defend some particular stance on the nature of natural theology, especially if this defense is, as in Swinburne's approach, essentially of a rationalistic kind. Now, I should stress here that I do accept David Bradshaw from this criticism, since although he's a philosopher by training, he clearly has a nuanced historical and theological understanding that's unusual among philosophers of religion. His recent book, for instance, on divine energies makes that absolutely clear, as indeed just many of his papers. In his introduction to the book on natural theology that he edited with Swinburne, he notes that major Orthodox scholars of the last century or so, Bulgakov, Lossky, Yanaras, and Zizoulas, have viewed natural theology, as he puts it, as at best religiously useless in that it does not lead to a true knowledge of or encounter with God, and at worst as positively harmful. In addition, he makes the vital point that the Greek patristic writers certainly recognized the distinction between faith and reason, but they tended to think of them as mutually supporting and interpenetrating. That's come out in what he says earlier in this webinar. Faith, he says in that chapter, that introduction, begins as an innate orientation towards the good, and reason, which depends on faith, is the attempt to bring this innate orientation to its full realization. No point in this process is autonomous and self-directed, for God is the good and he is constantly active, presenting the good to us in various forms, so that every choice we make is in some sense a response to him. It is this doubly synergistic view, involving the synergy of human faith and reason and of both with God, which determines the definite but subordinate role that the Greek fathers gave to natural theology. Now, I agree totally with him in this, but I've urged that we should expand this perspective so as to distance ourselves even more from an autonomous, rationalistic natural theology of the sort that became very common in the West in the scholastic period, in the late medieval times, and also in the modern world. I've done this partly by invoking Vladimir Lossky's comment that theology is always mystical and is something that must be approached, to quote Lossky, in such a fashion that instead of assimilating the mystery to our mode of understanding, we should, on the contrary, look for a profound change, an inner transformation of the spirit, enabling us to experience it mystically. I've linked this stress in various things I've written to an ancient concept that's used especially in the Hesychast tradition, but is to be found throughout the patristic writings. This is the concept that there's a noetic perception that arises from the full use of the mental capacity that in Greek is termed the nous, a faculty that is, especially in the thought of the Hesychast, quite distinct from the rational discursive faculty, which they term the anoia. Therefore, when David talks about the nous, I think we have to be careful that we don't simply translate it, as we tend to in modern English, into the word intellect, which we tend to think of simply as the foundation for rational discursive thinking. It is, in the ancient world, something rather more. Now here, the notion of contemplation, theoria in Greek, becomes important because this contemplation was seen, especially in Hesychast thinking, in terms of the direct perception or vision of the nous, which is often in Orthodox literature called the eye of the soul. In relation to the cosmos, for example, from the time of the 4th century writer Evagrius Ponticus, there was much talk of contemplation of nature, theoria physicae, in which, as Bruce Fultz has put it, the same kind of noetic contemplative deportment that Plato had reserved solely for the eternal forms, denuded of any earthly encumbrance, is now directed towards the cosmos itself. As a non-Orthodox patristic scholar has put it, this contemplation of nature was seen by Evagrius as involving two things: not only considerable familiarity with scripture and some degree of philosophical training, but also a radically altered state in which the mystic is transformed. Later, as Father Dorio Costacea has emphasized, this understanding was often broadened by Saints Basil the Great and Maximus the Confessor, for example, so as to be applicable to all Christians and not just to highly educated ones. Even then, however, the notion of the importance of spiritual transformation was still maintained, at least to the extent that ascetical effort was seen as essential, so that we could get away from the passions which distorted the way in which our discursive reasoning worked. What Bradshaw has said of science seems in this context to be true also of natural theology in its analytic form, that it has an orientation that is fundamentally anti-ascetic, in that it presupposes that there is no connection between one's ability to understand reality and the moral character or the state of one's soul. My conclusion then is that just in the very old Star Trek episode, Mr. Spogg once said to the captain of the Starship Enterprise, "It's life, Jim, but not as we know it." So in answer to the question of whether there's a natural theology and authentic orthodoxy, we need to say it's natural theology, Jim, but not as we know it, if we take it to mean what the analytic philosopher usually takes it to mean. A few minor points just to finish off with. I think that Yaroslav Pelikan's book on the natural theology of the Cappadocian Fathers, the title is Christianity and Classical Culture, reinforces the perspectives I've outlined, especially when interpreted in terms of arguments developed by one of the most interesting Western scholars of the 20th century, Thomas Torrance, who had a strong interest in patristic perspectives. Indeed, he was made, so it said, an honorary proto-presbyter of the Orthodox Church in Alexandria. Torrance attacks the Western scholastic tendency to separate natural theology from theology based on God's revelation of himself in historical acts. And indeed, that separation is specifically attacked also from within the Orthodox world by Father Dimitri Staniloy. Now, behind this Western separation is, I've argued, an Augustinian aspect, understanding of the effects of original sin, which is different from the Orthodox understanding of ancestral sin. The more optimistic understanding of the fallen human condition, in which contemplation is still effective, sees the role of rational argument, I've argued, in a slightly different way. We can talk about that in the questions if we like. Torrance attacks in particular the Western scholastic notion of natural theology as something independent of any faith commitment, the notion that it may be seen as providing what Western scholastics call preambles of faith, preambula fidei in Latin. Here it's interesting that recent scholars of Aquinas have seen Thomas Aquinas' use of this notion as ambiguous, with Roberto di Cagliari, for example, arguing that Aquinas takes the truths of faith as orientation and criterion for rational inquiry, and James Brent commenting that Aquinas practiced both theology and natural theology rather freely and blended them into a unified architectonic wisdom. His architectonic contains both theology and natural theology. Sometimes they're difficult to sort out. Indeed, I might add here that even some scholars of Anselm, who gives perhaps a classic argument in natural theology, have argued that in fact it wasn't a rationalistic argument, it was contemplative. I think Anselm Fultz was the first person who pointed that out, though more recent scholars have looked at that in a slightly more nuanced way. So also, even in terms of analytic philosophy, I believe there's still an intuitive noetic aspect to argument, insofar as different weights are intuitively assigned to different arguments for and against the reality of God. I once said that to Richard Swinburne, and he said, "Ah, yes, weight," and didn't go any further. My argument then is not against natural theology as such, but against the use of its arguments and the kind of philosophy of religion that's approached differently to the kind of philosophical theology that sees natural theology as having what Bradshaw calls the definite but subordinate role that the Greek fathers gave to natural theology. In the philosophy of religion, as usually understand, it's an entirely separate pursuit, if you like, which has very little, if anything, to do with God's revelation of himself. Now, I don't argue that we can't use natural theology. I still think there's a proper apologetic use of natural theological arguments. But their role, I've argued, is not to provide proof or probability arguments for the reality of God, so much as to act as catalysts for noetic processes that are deeper than those of rational argument. Again, Richard Swinburne once said to me that he knew people who had apparently been converted to theistic belief by his arguments. And I said to him, "I'm sure your arguments were important in the process, but the process wasn't ultimately one of simply being convinced by a rational argument." Now, when we talk about faith and its role, I think there's an interesting link between faith and the nous to be found particularly in Gregory of Nyssa. I can't say much more about that here, but if we look at Martin Laird's book, Gregory of Nyssa and the Grasp of Faith, we get a clear sense of the way in which Gregory of Nyssa actually took on many Neoplatonic perspectives on what faith was, but actually Christianized them, but still, in a sense, linked faith to what the Neoplatonists saw as what Laird calls the crest of the wave of nous. I might say a little bit more about Richard Swinburne later on, because I think we have to be careful not to feel that the way he converted to orthodoxy in the 1990s suddenly made his arguments orthodox ones rather than the Anglican ones that they'd effectively been before. It's interesting that when new editions of his books after his conversion came out, he didn't really change them in any obvious way. As I say, if questions come up about that, I'll talk about them. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The important thing, though, is that I think that David is absolutely right. There is a place for Orthodox theology, natural theology within the Orthodox tradition. There always has been a place, based in part, as Pelican points out, on the pagan tradition of philosophical natural theology. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, if we take the notion that, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it, and apply it to natural theology, it's entirely applicable. It's not natural theology as we know it if we define natural theology as modern analytic philosophers of religion tend to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I wasn't sure whether I was muted. I would expect that there are questions. I need to find out how to no open questions. There is, yes. Nicholas Aspoulis has a hand up. I don't know if that's a question or to explain the process.
Thank you both the presenters for their enlightened presentations. I have a question two questions actually for both of you. The first has to do with a definition of natural theology in terms of Orthodox theology, in the context of Orthodox theology. Is there any definition, or philosophical or natural theology is closely linked to philosophical theology, or is it a kind of analytic philosophy as well? This is the first. The second, starting from an Orthodox perspective, can we argue for analogia entis in terms of natural theology? Thank you.
Would David like to go first on that?
Well, I'll take a swing at it. The second question is a hard one, but as far as the first question goes, it's worth noting the term natural theology doesn't occur in the Greek Fathers, as far as I'm aware. It was a term that's more out of the Latin tradition. The first attested mention we have is by Augustine in the City of God. Now, he's referring there to an earlier Latin author, Varro, and Varro gave a threefold distinction of types of theology. The theology of the city, in other words, the public theology of worship in the temples, that one could conform to without even believing very much of anything. Then mythical theology, all the stories and myths that about the gods. And then natural theology was different from those because it seeks to understand God or the gods through nature. And he probably had in mind the Stoics in the first place, and maybe secondarily Plato and Aristotle. But at least at that time that he was writing, Stoicism was probably the dominant influence. So that's I think in modern terms, that would be a pretty narrow construal of what natural theology is. It certainly would include that knowledge of God available through nature. But a lot of people today would take the term more broadly to include any knowledge of God, including God's existence or God's attributes, that's available through, if you will, publicly accessible means, including historical evidence and accounts of human experience. So I know that Swinburne, for example, puts a lot of weight on the argument from religious experience. for him, that, takes you far beyond where you can get, say, using the design argument, in terms of a level of confidence in the reality of God. And I believe he even includes historical evidence, which would then encompass, the truth of the resurrection and other miracles and historical evidence of the truth of Christ. Now, there's a famous problem here, the one that Lessing referred to as the broad, ugly ditch between any amount of historical evidence you can have for Christ performing miracles or even rising from the dead, and the faith, the attitude of commitment and trust and conviction in Christ that's kind of an existential attitude, and never just a response to evidence. So, and Kierkegaard, as you know, made a lot of this and talked about how there has to be a kind of a leap of faith to cross that ditch between evidence and conviction and faith. And I don't think Swinburne would deny that. But the point I'm making is simply that natural theology can be understood in a more narrow or a broader way. I think the broader way that Swinburne takes does somewhat address some of the concerns about sort of analytic philosophy getting too big for its britches, you might say, and trying to bite off more than it's really capable of addressing. I think that's a fair concern. But if you remember that these arguments do include a lot of what we might consider to be more traditionally considered as apologetics, that does broaden the context. The second question about the analogy of being, does natural theology support or provide grounds for the analogy of being? I tend to shy away from that, because that term analogia entis, of course, that's a kind of a Latinism, I guess, formed out of Greek. But it's not a term that the Greek fathers typically would use. And they don't typically use analogy as sort of the structure for understanding the nature of theological language the way that someone like Aquinas does. I think Aquinas is reading the account in Metaphysics Book 4 of focal meaning, how substance is the focal category in relation to the other 9 categories that are accidents, and how terms like being and good and one all have their focal meaning in relation to substance, and only secondarily in relation to the accidents. And he's transferring that to God and saying God also, the theological terms have their focal meaning in relation to God and secondarily in relation to creatures. The fathers just don't think in those terms. They think in more Platonic terms of image and archetype or paradigm. Dionysius the Areopagite, for instance, says this in the Divine Names, that the qualities present in creatures, being and goodness and power and life, are images of those that are present in God as their divine source. And I tend to think that's, to my mind at least, better, partly because it's less technical. It doesn't lend itself to a kind of a technical elaboration the way the theory of analogy does. And so the fathers tend to leave it at that and develop the qualities of creatures, the reality of creatures in that light, in a more Platonic way. That again, my paper, I think, also illustrated, beginning with God as the good and the presence of the good within the human heart through the innate structure of human desire. That's probably more than you were asking for in your question. So, Father Christopher, I should give you a turn at it too.
Well, I'm sure David is right that, in fact, the term natural theology is one that's very much come out of Western Christian theology, and it's been developed in a very particular way, which, in the ways that I indicated earlier, are not quite the same, and sometimes not at all the same, I think, as the natural theology that I see in the patristic literature in the Christian East. There is an interesting question of what of how natural theology fits into a slightly broader category called natural religion. But that involves all sorts of processes which, again, are not about discursive rationality. I don't want to go into that, but nevertheless, I think to talk about natural theology in terms of natural religion is interesting, because I think natural religion can fit into an Orthodox perspective, particularly in relation to some of the things that I was saying about the intuitive aspect of the nous. Now, as to the analogy of being, again, I've certainly come across Orthodox authors who feel this is a fundamental mistake in Western scholastic theology, certainly. And one gets it even, I'm afraid, in Richard Swinburne. I hate to keep attacking him, because whenever I've met him, I found him a delightful person and enjoyed talking to him. But it's interesting that right at the beginning of the Coherence of Theism, at least in its first edition, which is the only one I looked at many years ago, he says the most, basic way of thinking about God is as a person, but as one without a body. And as various other people have said, the use of the word person in terms of philosophical theology is actually rather complicated. And in fact, I think it to some extent affects a lot of analytic philosophy of religion. In relation to him, for example, the Orthodox philosopher Christoph Schneider has commented that Swinburne gives mainly doctrinal and pastoral reasons for his conversion to Orthodoxy. Apart from a short reference to John of Damascus and Gregory of Nyssa, the reader is left in the dark as to why there should be a particular affinity between Swinburne's interpretation of metaphysical theism and the Orthodox tradition. And he also mentions Swinburne's substance dualism, as he calls it, as something which can't easily fit into Orthodox theology. However, I go even further than Christoph Schneider does in these terms of what the Orthodox philosopher David Bentley Hart has said about contemporary philosophy of religion. Many contemporary philosophers of religion, he says, quote, have effectively broken with classical theistic tradition, adopting a style of thinking that the Dominican philosopher Brian Davis calls theistic personalism. This seems to involve a view of God not conspicuously different from the polytheistic picture of the gods as merely very powerful discrete entities who possess a variety of distinct attributes that lesser entities also possess, if in smaller measure. It's a way of thinking, Hart goes on, that suggests that God, since is only a particular instantiation of various concepts and properties, is logically dependent on some more comprehensive reality, embracing both him and other beings. For philosophers who think in this way, practically all the traditional metaphysical attempts to understand God as the source of all reality become impenetrable. Now, I know that David Bentley Hart is a slightly controversial figure because some of the things that he's written, but it does seem to me that in that comment, he actually puts his finger on something very important. And I've certainly also read Brian Davis on this, that when we think about God, we have to be very careful, as indeed Dionysius the Areopagite in the text that David quoted does, when he says, we cannot apply things that we know in association with created things directly to God. And it's, that's the basis of the apophatic tradition in the way that Vladimir Lossky actually expressed it in his, classic book, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. So, as I say, I would go a little further than David. I would not only want to say that we need to be wary of the analogy of being, I would say that it's actually a fundamental difference between what I see as the central Orthodox approach and much Western theology as it's developed within philosophical theology and the philosophy of religion over the last, well, given that it goes back to Aquinas, a very long time indeed.
Thank you very much, Father Christopher and David. I'm told that there's a question from Father Vasilios Thermos, although I cannot see it on my screen. Yes, Father Vasilios, would you like to? Thank you. We can't hear you properly. Could you put the question in the chat or try again? No, it's still going at sort of double speed. Could you possibly put the question in the chat? Or do you want to try again? No, it's the same. Perhaps while Father Vasilios is typing, Father Isidoros Katsos, I think, wanted to say something. So Father Vasilios, if you could possibly type yours, please, and Father Isidoros, if your microphone's working, would you like to ask yours?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. I must say I'm very sympathetic to the direction that the conversation has taken, which was not so clear in the case of the book, which seemed to be going at least some way towards the direction of Richard Swinburne's understanding of natural theology, especially when he says in his own contribution that my version of natural theology is what the church fathers were doing, you know, and clearly this is a different, it's a response to that, and I think I'm inclined to agree. However, the point that Richard Swinburne has raised to me in personal conversations on this is the following: is what do you do with all the patristic texts who addressed the atheists, especially on the psalmist verse, you know, the fool said to himself, there is no God. And this is a trope that we find already in the patristic text. Is not Anselm the first to do it. To go beyond Richard Swinburne, it's not about Swinburne. I mean, the analytic Western theologian would say, okay, if that's the direction, if what Professor Bradshaw and Father Christopher said tonight in the direction of the Orthodox
Father Isidoros, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's not very clear. I don't know whether you can go further or closer or something. Is there anything you can do that might improve the sound?
Better now?
So far, yes.
Okay, so the question is, so the analytic theologian would say, if that is how you understand natural theology, is there any Orthodox apologetics? Because I'm not interested in a different definition and understanding of natural theology. That might be the case. If you want to say that what I am doing is apologetics, my question to you, fellow Orthodox, is do you have any genuine Orthodox apologetics to address the person who is an atheist? Thank you.
May I go first on that one?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, if you're happy with that, I will say. I mean, first of all, when Richard Swinburne says he's doing what the church fathers were doing, there is a degree of truth in that, but what he's not doing is reading the church fathers in the wider context of what they were writing. Even in early modern natural theology, something like William Ray's The Wisdom of God in the Works of Creation, for example, which I think is a great book. It was easy for slightly later rationalists in the 18th century to take up his arguments and present them as purely rational arguments. But if you read John Ray carefully, you get a strong sense that he's trying to evoke awe in his readers. He's not saying, here is a purely rational argument. Now, I think the church fathers were doing something similar in many ways. And as I say, the total context is one in which I think rational argument and something which exists at a deeper level, which is what I'd call this sort of noetic apprehension of reality, are working in what David Bradshaw has called synergy. Now, in terms of apologetics, I think you're quite right that we should see some of the patristic literature which comes under the heading of natural theology certainly as apologetic arguments. In fact, one of the Gregories, either Nyssa or Nazianzus, explicitly says, in terms of what we now see as natural theology, that it's trying to actually provide a rational basis for the mystery. But he actually goes on to link the mystery to the rational argument. That's pointed out in Yaroslav Pelikan's book. And I think as I said in my talk, apologetics is very important. There are many people in the world who think that there are good philosophical arguments against the reality of God. You know, it doesn't take a long time to browse through a library and find both good and rather poor philosophical arguments of that sort. The important thing, I think, is, as I said when I was talking about apologetics, though only briefly, what people need in order to make that sort of conversion to theistic belief is in fact something which is happening both at the rational level and at that deeper noetic level, and the two are linked. So what you're doing in rational argument, saying, look, you know, the belief in God is not irrational, which is what you're effectively saying, is removing the barrier to something that in some people is already happening at an unconscious and noetic level. That's how I see the role of natural theology, both in the fathers and in the modern Orthodox context. And indeed, you know, my book, Science and the Christian Faith, for example, which came out in 2020, was very much saying to ordinary Orthodox believers, look, our belief is not irrational in relation to the way the world can be perceived scientifically. But at the same time, I then in that book, I said briefly what I expanded a little bit in my later book, Eastern Orthodoxy and the Science Theology Dialogue. I was more or less saying straightforwardly, you cannot be argued into belief in God, but what you can do is come to recognize that the arguments against the reality of God, which are common in our society, are in fact much poorer arguments than one recognizes. And I quoted that book, Michael Ruse, who is an atheist, but also quite a good philosopher, particularly a philosopher of biology. And Michael Ruse once said of Richard Dawkins, who sometimes throws out sort of quasi-philosophical arguments, he said, Dawkins is the sort of atheist who makes me ashamed to be an atheist. I think that's where apologetics come in. I think we can recognize that some of these arguments can demolish the arguments against the reality of God, or at least strongly question them, which are out there in the world, in a way that helps people develop, you know, that sort of inner unconscious attitude of faith, which is what both David and I, in our slightly different ways, have emphasized. So that's the role, I think. There is an Orthodox apologetics. There is an Orthodox natural theology, provided that we don't see it purely in the way that Richard Swinburne does. And I think that what David in particular did in that introduction to the book that he edited with Swinburne is part of the way, as I've indicated, in which we work out what a natural theology is in that wider Orthodox context. But ultimately, what I want to say is that Orthodoxy is experiential. You know, it's not just about arguments that go round in my head about whether God exists or God doesn't exist or whatever. It's something about the totality of the human experience, which is far more than what goes on, and which is why I make this distinction, which is there particularly in the hesychastic tradition, between rational argument, if you like, dianoia, you know, that capacity we have for that, and the nous, as they tend to see it, and many of the early Greek philosophers tended to see it as well, as at one level the sort of basis of rational argument, but at another level effectively an intuitive understanding of reality, which we don't reach purely by that sort of discursive arguments. David might want to expand on that or question it.
Yeah, let me be brief, because I know there's another question, but I think a wonderful illustration of what you're talking about, Father, is the story of Elder Zosima and the brothers Karamazov, where he has the experience of learning to repent, of learning to apologize and ask forgiveness of his social inferior, his servant. And then he experiences how that opens the world and almost transforms the world around him. And he begins to see beauty in ways that he hadn't before. And he begins to understand that the evil in the world, you know, which is, as you mentioned, that's one of the things that atheists like to really focus on. Well, that evil comes from me, you know, that I cannot separate myself from that evil. It begins in the human heart. And so that, I think, is what conversion, effective conversion, really has to be. It has to begin with the experience of repentance, and apologetics can take you a long way toward that, and a lot of different, things can come in. You look at Athanasius, and in the life of Antony, he has that dialogue of Antony with the philosophers toward the end. And Antony gives apologetic arguments. He says, look at the power of the cross over demons. Look at the courage of the martyrs. Look at how Christian faith has ennobled people that philosophy never could have touched, unlearned, unlettered people. It has made them people of great courage and great integrity. Those are apologetic arguments, and I think they're good arguments. And I think they're important, but they have to lead you up to the point of sort of turning within and asking yourself, well, who am I then? And what should I do? As we see in the story of Zosima. Anyway, that's just a quick thought. Elizabeth, I think there might be someone else.
Yes, thank you very much. Father Vasilios Thermos has managed to type his question, and there was another question from your notes, Moise. So I will read Father Vasilios's question, and your notes, if you could possibly briefly give your question after that, and then perhaps the two panelists can give a brief response to both. So Father Vasilios says, thank you. And what have been the historical and conceptual connections between natural theology and the Roman Catholic idea of natural law? And he's asking this because both have been strongly associated with reason. Therefore, moral theology has also been contaminated, in inverted commas, by reason. And to him, the issue is whether and how Orthodox theology can or should develop more existentially, which would be a form of natural theology. We have the counterexample of Protestantism, so we hope it would never consider human experience as a source equivalent to divine revelation, but a psychologically informed theology may become more sensitive pastorally and more relevant to the contemporary world. Wouldn't that be a form of natural theology? And your notes, would you like to ask your question, please? Your notes, Moise, are you here and within earshot? It seems not. So would you like to respond to Father Vasilios's?
Well, my first thought is there's not a simple path from natural theology, even the way it's done in scholasticism, to scholastic ideas of natural law. And particularly if you have in mind the sort of the narrow form of natural law that you find when they deal with, say, sexual ethics. You probably know John T. Noonan's book, Contraception, that's still, even though it's, like, I don't know, 40 years old, it's still a really valuable history of how natural law developed within the medieval West, and how it took on a certain form shaped by canon law, shaped by Gratian's Decretum and so forth, also Peter Lombard, largely kind of by their selective appropriation of Augustine. And it was a separate discipline that operated, as far as I'm aware, largely independently of natural theology, the way it was done by people like Anselm or Aquinas or Scotus. So that's not to say there's no connection, but it seems to me that we have to think of these as parallel streams, at least in the Middle Ages. Father Christopher, I don't know if you have further comment on that.
I'd only say I think there is one common root, if you like, particularly between the two, in the sense that there's an attempt to read from what we see in the natural world to some sort of either natural theology argument or natural law. And what you've brought up, which is sexual ethics, is, I think, very important there. I did once write an article in a Dominican journal about contraception, partly attacking the natural law tradition, because I saw that tradition, as indeed of many Roman Catholic critics of the present Roman Catholic way of looking at things, which sort of read the natural world, so to speak, and say, well, it's obvious that sex is about procreation primarily. Now, from an Orthodox perspective, I think there are also, I've just been rereading after many years, John Meyendorff's book on Christian marriage, for example, which gives a very different point of view. And, you know, there are other things. There's that lovely book called Christianity and Eros by, somebody will remind me of the...
Philip Sherrod.
Philip Sherrod, of course. You know, which actually give a far different understanding of what the relationship between men and women, particularly in marriage, should be. So I think there is a link there between natural law and natural theology, in that both tend to try and read something off from the natural world as we experience it empirically towards some sort of overall way of looking at things. But I just say, in terms of the second part of that question, I think the idea that, you know, we can develop an existential natural theology which is psychologically informed, that I think is very important. But it might be best if we don't use the term natural theology. I think the problem with the natural theology phrase is quite simply that it's so tied now in many people's minds to a particular sort of analytic natural theology that's developed in the modern world in particular, but can be traced back to late medieval Western scholasticism, that we perhaps need to, as I say, have a... Certainly in the science theology dialogue, it's interesting that there is a tendency to separate natural theologies from what's sometimes called theology of nature, where theology of nature is based on revelation. So it doesn't say there's no connection between theology and nature, but it says that we start from a revealed religious framework and then we interpret nature in terms of that. So that's where I would come at that, you know, to that particular question, which is a very good one.
Right. If David, you have further? We've got, if we have time, there are two more questions in the Q&A. One, Joshua, yes, we're told we have time. Joshua Roberts, isn't rationality itself mysterious? The grasping or apprehension present in logic, in the rational, is not in itself clearly reducible to what causes it to be present in us or in the world. And there's an anonymous question talking about what is the strategy pursued by the discussion of natural theology and Orthodox Christianity. In other words, if I understand the question properly, what's the point? Is this an attempt to prove that natural theology is also something that Orthodox theology does? Do we try to square the differences between the ways God is understood in the West and the East? Why should we want to demonstrate that Orthodox theologians also do natural theology? Again, if you could comment on those two, please. Thank you.
Well, okay, I'll try to be brief, but so far as the second question, what's the point? Why should we even try to show that Orthodox theologians do natural theology? I think part of it's just the integrity of our Orthodox tradition. You do find natural theological arguments in the fathers very frequently, and particularly the argument from design, like I mentioned. And they play an important role. They help to, you know, whenever the fathers are addressing a broad audience that includes non-believers, that's usually one of the first things they'll do in order to try to nudge the non-believer to at least be open-minded to the possibility of divine revelation. And I think that's still important today. I mean, atheism not only exists, it's far more prevalent and far more complex and highly ramified than it was in the ancient world. So I think here's a point where I would agree with Swinburne that natural theological arguments are very useful in that sort of a secular context. For instance, the argument from design, you know, is you can find versions of it today that take account of things like the fine-tuning of the laws of nature that are very interesting and very sophisticated and carry a lot of weight. even with often with non-believers. Anyway, that's kind of one answer to that question. The other one about isn't rationality itself something mysterious? I would agree if what you mean by that is that we cannot prove that rationality is itself reasonable or that we should seek to be rational, because to prove anything, you have to presuppose reason itself. You have to presuppose the efficacy of argument and inference from conclusions to some premise. And you also have to presuppose the value of doing that. There's a wonderful passage in Nietzsche that I think to me was really illuminating, to see Nietzsche as an atheist come to this realization that reason relies on an act of faith, a kind of a prior attitude to seek truth as something that is of preeminent value and that has a kind of authority over us. And Nietzsche recognizes that as a kind of faith. That's in section 344 of the Gay Science. If anyone wants to look at that, it's a fascinating passage. And to me, that's, if I'm kind of doing apologetics, to me, that's one of the best starting points. Not to ask people to focus on the natural world or anything, but ask them to focus on the operation of reason itself and how reason has certain presuppositions that themselves cannot be proven through the operation of reason. They have to simply be assumed. And isn't that a kind of faith? And the fact that someone like Nietzsche thought so, I think, is significant. So those are my quick answers. Father?
Thank you.
Yes, I would largely agree with that. Is rationality mysterious? Again, in the scientific world, it's interesting that mathematics seems to correspond to the way the world is. We take it almost for granted. But as Peter Berger, the sociologist, pointed out in a book of 50 years ago or more now, called A Rumour of Angels, there's no reason why that should actually be the case. And he saw it as one of the signs of transcendence, which made him take religious belief seriously. So that's certainly the one of the ways I would approach this. What's the strategy? What's the difference between East and West? Well, first of all, I think one of the things about East and West in the Christian world is that we sometimes in the Orthodox Church overemphasize our difference. We do it properly, that lot do it terribly. There are all sorts of overlaps which we need to take into account. And we need sometimes, as Metropolitan Callistos of Dioclea once said, we need to learn from our younger brothers, as he put it, in the West, because they can sometimes teach us things about our own tradition that we might not otherwise have learned. But it's not ultimately about that. I think it is the case, as David has said, that the fathers certainly use natural theology arguments, but actually, one of our problems in the Orthodox Church, if I'm honest, is that we think that anything that one of the fathers read is almost, sacred scripture. And again, Metropolitan Callistos once pointed out that we need to separate patristic wheat from patristic chaff. Not everything that the fathers said is something that applies straightforwardly to us now. And we have to recognize that at least some of their arguments with design look distinctly wobbly in the light of modern science and of, as I was saying earlier, I didn't quote the fathers, I quoted William Paley, but nevertheless, some of the earlier arguments from design have something of that we have to take into account. Finally, I just mentioned fine-tuning, which David mentioned. A very interesting thing, which again I've talked about in my books, but as John Polkinghorne, one of the major Western commentators on science and theology, once said, and he was very sympathetic towards natural theology, much more than many of his colleagues in that field. He said, that it's persuasive, but not logically coercive. There is this sense that it's not a knockdown argument. And many people would actually say that we really don't understand enough about the universe yet to really be able to use fine-tuning arguments in that sort of way. So again, a very good question, but I think we need to, as I say, just be a little bit careful about our tendency to say, well, Saint so-and-so said it, therefore this is Orthodox theology. We do need to separate patristic wheat from patristic chaff. And part of the chaff is that they actually used the science of their time, which was not very good by modern standards. St. John Chrysostom seemed to believe in a flat Earth some of the time. Some of the time he talked about a round Earth, but said, well, if the Antipodes exist, nobody could possibly live there. St. Basil had a very good argument, or at least the conclusion was right, but based on the idea that things like eels don't have parents. It was bad science. And we can't simply say, well, if St. Basil thought that eels don't have parents, we as Orthodox have to think that too. So we have to be very careful in the way that we use the patristic literature and recognize that it's the consensus of the fathers and their theological meaning which is ultimately important to us.
Well, thank you very much to both of you and to all the audience and the questioners. I apologize for the late start, which was entirely due to my technical problems. But it's been a very useful discussion, and we can go home and look up a number of the writings that both our panelists have written on the subject and give further thought to the matter. So many thanks to both of you, to everyone in Volos, and to everyone who's attended. And for pretty well the last time for this year, Christ is risen, Christos Anesti.
Yeah, that's